Slavery in America was a brutal institution that inflicted immense suffering on black people. We often hear about the atrocities committed by white male slaveholders, but there is a lesser-known chapter of this horror that remains largely untold: the abuse of black male slaves by white women. This hidden history is as real and disturbing as any other aspect of slavery. Enslaved black men lived in a world where not only white masters but also mistresses wielded power over their bodies and lives. In this video, we will uncover the stories of black male slaves who endured both physical and sexual abuse at the hands of white women. This is a difficult history, but one that black audiences deserve to know. When discussing slavery, white women are often portrayed as bystanders or gentle figures in the household. The reality was far different. White women were deeply embedded in the slave-owning class and were co-conspirators in slavery's brutality. Historians estimate that roughly 40% of all slave owners were white women, a staggering number that challenges old assumptions. Owning human beings was not exclusively a man's enterprise. Many white women owned, bought, and sold enslaved people with vigor. For daughters of the planter class, enslaved people were often given as gifts from childhood. One historian notes that slaveholding parents typically gave their daughters more enslaved people than land, tying slave ownership to a young white woman's identity and status. From an early age, these girls were taught that power over black lives was their birthright. On southern plantations, a white mistress often held as much authority as the master. If the husband was away, or even when he was present, the mistress managed daily operations and discipline. Enslaved people recognized this. In narratives and interviews, former slaves described white women as active participants in enforcement and punishment. They were not the demure, hands-off figures that later romantic tales of the Old South suggested. White women understood that their position in society, their freedom, comfort, and even marriages could depend on the number of slaves they controlled. Marriage prospects for a Southern belle improved if she brought a sizable enslaved workforce with her. Once married, many fought to keep ownership of their slaves rather than cede all authority to their husbands. Some even battled in court to keep legal title over inherited people, and they often won. For these women, slavery was their freedom, a means of autonomy and influence in a society that otherwise limited their rights. From girlhood onward, white females in slave-holding families were groomed to be mistresses. They watched their fathers, brothers, and husbands exert control over enslaved people, and they learned to do the same. A culture of violence pervaded plantation life, and white women were very much a part of it. Little white girls played at being masters of their own child slaves, mimicking the authority figures around them. Some were encouraged to practice domination. Former slaves recalled that even young white girls would beat slaves to assert power. One remembered that it didn't matter whether the child was large or small, they always beat you till the blood ran down. Such testimony reveals a chilling truth. Violence toward black bodies was normalized for white children, especially girls preparing to run households of their own. By adulthood, these women fully embraced the role of slave mistress, complete with the entitlement to punish and profit from the people they owned. Enslaved black men often found themselves under the control of white women. Sometimes the mistress owned them outright. Other times she acted on behalf of her husband or family. Either way, a black man might answer daily to the lady of the house, taking her commands, laboring in her service, and risking her wrath if she deemed his work unsatisfactory. White women managed male slaves as cooks, butlers, stable hands, blacksmiths, field laborers, and more. Even George Washington's Mount Vernon grew in enslaved numbers because of his wife, Martha Washington. When she married George, Martha brought dozens of enslaved people into their household. Her wealth in human chattel far exceeded George's at the time. This example shows how even the first president's power was augmented by a woman's status as a slave owner. Across the South, innumerable plantations functioned with the mistress as enforcer and decision-maker. Earlier histories often ignored these accounts, preferring the romantic image of the Southern belle, but black witnesses remembered the truth. White women, they said, had a deep economic investment in slavery and exercised extraordinary control. They were not merely following men's orders, They were giving orders. They bought and sold people for profit, broke up families if it suited them, and defended slavery because it benefited them personally. By understanding the role of white women in the slave power structure, we see the groundwork for the abuses that followed. These women had motive, means, and opportunity to mistreat enslaved people, including black men. Their gender did not make them more compassionate. In many cases, it was the opposite. Some wielded cruelty as a tool, knowing the system would shield them from repercussions. Enslaved black men lived under the domination of both white men and white women, a double burden that could turn deadly at a moment's notice. Life under a cruel mistress could be a nightmare for enslaved people. White women slaveholders were fully capable of physical brutality, and many did not hesitate to whip, beat, or torture when it suited them. In the slave South, violence was the primary tool for maintaining control, and mistresses used it freely. Enslaved black men felt the sting of these punishments in workshops, fields, and especially in the household where the mistress's word was law. The image of a demure lady fainting at the sight of violence is a myth. Accounts by enslaved people describe women who were vicious taskmasters. One harrowing example comes from the testimony of Tom Hawkins, who had been enslaved in South Carolina. His owner, Miss Annie, was her own whooping boss. She never delegated discipline but punished her slaves personally. Hawkins described how she kept a contraption for whipping, a barrel pierced through with a pole. When a slave angered her, the person would be stripped naked, tied face down over the barrel, hands and feet bound. Then Miss Annie would light her tobacco pipe, sit down, and flog the exposed back and legs mercilessly, sometimes for an hour. She beat men and women alike for the smallest infractions. Hawkins, a child in her household, recalled that even he wasn't spared mild abuse. She yanked his ears or hair if he was slow to respond. He knew from what he saw that she was capable of much worse. Miss Annie ran her estate with an iron hand, never needing a jail because her punishments inspired constant fear. White women often carried out punishments themselves, but even when they didn't, they orchestrated violence through others. A mistress could order an overseer or even another slave to administer the lash. Some enslaved men were forced to punish their own peers at a mistress's command, creating resentment and fear within the community. Mistresses also exploited jealousy to fuel violence. When a white wife suspected or resented her husband's sexual abuse of an enslaved woman, she often took her rage out on the victim. The most infamous case is Patsy, described in Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave. Mary Epps, consumed by jealousy, demanded Patsy be whipped savagely and even tried to bribe Northup to kill her. Patsy was flayed nearly to death under the combined orders of Master and Mistress Epps. While her story highlights a woman's suffering, it also illustrates how a white woman's vindictiveness could mean deadly peril for any enslaved person. A black man suspected of theft or insolence could just as easily find himself lashed at a mistress's demand. Some mistresses even seemed to take pleasure in the act, indulging sadism under slavery's protection. Enslaved black men had to navigate this minefield daily. A mistress might inspect their work, scold them for being too slow, or strike them for a mistake. A house servant faced constant risk. A spilled drink or a glance misread could provoke violence. Men working in stables or fields for widows were entirely at their mercy, with no male master present. Some enslaved men later recalled that certain mistresses were harsher than masters, imposing stricter routines or harsher lashes for small errors. Some may have felt they had to prove their toughness in a male-dominated society, but more often it was the corrupting effect of unchecked power. Mistresses also used collective punishment and terror. A woman might threaten to sell a disobedient slave's family member, leveraging the heartbreak of separation as punishment. For a black man, hearing, "I will sell your wife away," was as terrifying as the whip. White women fully understood the value of enslaved people as commodities and used sales to enforce obedience. Some even became entrepreneurial, training enslaved people in skills to fetch higher prices. Miss Annie, for example, regularly sold people from her estate and kept an auction block in her yard to display them. The image of a refined lady auctioning human beings in her garden reveals the depth of her involvement in slavery's cruelty. In 1834, a fire exposed her attic filled with mutilated and chained enslaved people. The revelations sparked outrage, and a mob drove her from the city. Yet such cases were exceptions. The routine brutalities of other mistresses, the whippings, beatings, and psychological torments, were accepted as ordinary practice for maintaining order. Black male slaves under white women owners therefore lived under the same regime of violence and intimidation as they did under men. The hand that held the whip could wear a lace glove as easily as a leather one. The screams from the whipping post sounded no different whether the order came from master or mistress. For the enslaved, there was no refuge in the supposed gentleness of womanhood. When weaponized by racism and absolute power, it could be every bit as destructive. And this cruelty laid the groundwork for an even darker form of abuse, when the control of white women crossed from physical coercion into the most intimate realm of sexual exploitation. Perhaps the most taboo and least discussed aspect of white women's abuse of enslaved black men is sexual exploitation. The very idea stands in stark contrast to long-held stereotypes. History has more readily portrayed black men as threats to white women, rather than victims of white women's sexual coercion. Yet during slavery, white women, from young girls to adult mistresses, sometimes forced or pressured black male slaves into sexual relationships. For black men, such encounters were perilous. They had no legal right to refuse, and if the liaison was discovered, it was the black man who would face deadly consequences. This created a horrific double bind: submit to the white woman's advances and risk the master's lethal rage, or resist and likely face violent punishment. There was no way for a black man to truly consent. The power imbalance was absolute. One of the clearest accounts comes from Harriet Jacobs, a formerly enslaved woman who published incidents in the life of a slave girl in 1861. Jacobs recalled a scandal in her town. A planter's daughter became pregnant, and the father was an enslaved black man from her father's plantation. This was no romance. Jacobs explains that the young woman selected one of the meanest slaves on her plantation to be the father of her first grandchild. The daughter exercised the same authority over the men slaves that her father did over the women slaves. Having grown up seeing her father exploit black women, she learned she could exploit black men. She chose a man over whom her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure. When her pregnancy became obvious, her father turned to rage and sought to revenge himself on the offending black man. The fate of that man was likely brutal punishment, death, or sale. The white daughter faced little beyond social shame. Jacob's account makes clear that enslaved men could be coerced into sex by white women and punished as villains for being victims. Jacobs noted this pattern was not isolated. She observed that the master's daughters knew enslaved women were at their father's sexual disposal, and some daughters exercised the same authority over the men slaves. Such incidents were hushed by whites and whispered about by blacks. A man might never confide in anyone, knowing exposure could mean death. Denied freedom in their own sexuality, some may have rebelled using the only targets available: enslaved men. At the same time, white culture was saturated with myths of black male virility. Curiosity, loneliness, or taboo desire may have driven some mistresses to pursue black men. But for the men, any such encounter was coercion. Whether framed as romance or threat, the choice did not exist. Some cases were blatantly coercive. Testimonies describe white women threatening slaves with harm or death if they did not submit. The threat of crying rape was perhaps the most terrifying. Every black man knew that if a white woman accused him, even falsely, mob violence or legal lynching would follow. The mere suggestion trapped men into compliance. Other forms were subtler but humiliating. Men might be forced into intimate duties such as bathing or massaging the mistress. Outsiders sometimes remarked on black male servants working half-naked in white households. Southern women showed no embarrassment, viewing black men not as men in society's sense, but as objects to be exposed or ordered about. These small violations of privacy often set the stage for greater ones. At times, white women escalated to outright sexual abuse. A man summoned on an errand might face a proposition or assault. Physical force was rarely needed. The threat of flogging or sale was enough. Some mistresses offered small favors, promises of better treatment, in exchange for compliance. Yet the risk always fell entirely on the man. If discovered, he faced death. If she regretted the act, she could destroy him with a single accusation. During slavery, a master could kill a man outright. Men lived in dread of pregnancies, since a mixed-race child born to a white woman was scandal and a death sentence for the father. Jacob's story shows that mistresses often targeted vulnerable men precisely because they were least able to resist or reveal the truth. Another form of abuse was the breeding of slaves. Black men were forced to impregnate enslaved women to increase the slave population. While often arranged by male owners, white women were complicit and sometimes directed couplings themselves. Young, strong men might be used as studs, compelled to sire children with multiple women. Consent was irrelevant. Men like Rufus in Texas were forced into fatherhood they could not claim, their children sold like livestock. This was rape by proxy, inflicted on both men and women, reducing them to tools of profit. All of this unfolded in silence. The rape of enslaved women was at least acknowledged by abolitionists, but the rape of men was almost entirely absent from public discourse. To many, the idea of a white woman violating a black man was unthinkable, so stories remained buried. Within the black community, silence also prevailed. Men often carried profound shame, fearing to admit violation that society said contradicted manhood. Yet the scars were real. Imagine the torment of a man summoned at night by a mistress, forced into her bed, then threatened into silence. He had to rise the next day and serve, hiding the secret while dreading the next summons. He could not tell his wife, his children, or his peers. The humiliation was crushing. This unspoken trauma weighed heavily on the spirits of black men, deepening the wounds inflicted by slavery. The abuses that enslaved black men suffered at the hands of white women left deep, lasting scars, both physical and emotional. These men were forced to endure what no person should, and to do so largely in silence. Understanding their trauma and resilience is crucial, especially for black audiences today, because it shows us what our forefathers overcame. The strong black male slave, often idealized as stoic and resilient, was still a human being with feelings, pride, and vulnerability. The systematic emasculation and violation they experienced were designed to break them down. Many did break under the strain, yet many also found ways to survive, resist in small ways, or hold on to a sense of self against all odds. Psychological emasculation was constant. Enslaved men lived in a culture where dominance and strength were prized. They tried to carve out manhood within bondage, perhaps by protecting their families, excelling in work, or nurturing dignity and faith. Yet being subjected to a white woman's control in violently intimate ways struck at their identity. To be beaten into submission by a woman they were supposed to be stronger than was deeply humiliating, though her social power trumped physical strength. To be used sexually and then silenced inverted every notion of autonomy. He could not protect himself or others in those moments. This induced helplessness and shame that could last a lifetime. Men had to continue functioning immediately after abuse. There was no pause, no chance to recover. A man whipped bloody by a mistress still had to get up before dawn to hitch horses or pick cotton. A man sexually abused at night might have to serve that same mistress at breakfast. This required immense mental compartmentalization. Some developed hardened exteriors, suppressing emotion to avoid showing weakness. Others grew depressed, their spirits broken in ways only loved ones might notice. Physical injuries also marked them permanently. Scars from whippings were visible reminders of cruelty. A man whose back was crisscrossed with lashes carried those marks for life. Injuries like broken bones or damaged eyes often led to chronic pain or disability. A man might lose an eye or limb, undermining his pride in being strong and able-bodied. Yet enslaved men were expected to endure stoically, hiding their suffering since complaints could be punished as insolence. Even those under relatively milder mistresses lived in anxiety. Knowing kindness could turn to rage instantly. The mental toll was severe. Many likely suffered what we would now call post-traumatic stress. Anxiety, nightmares, and hypervigilance were natural responses to continual threat. If a mistress was volatile or sadistic, enslaved men tread carefully around her moods. This constant stress trained them to minimize themselves, always appearing non-threatening, which white owners misread as contentment when in truth it was survival. Still, resilience appeared in subtle ways. Some men reclaimed agency by feigning illness or delaying work to avoid abuse. Others risked escape. Tom Hawkins mentioned a man named Willis who hid in a cave for years rather than endure brutality. Faith and community also gave strength. Enslaved men turned to spirituals, prayer, and secret gatherings. Songs and prayers carried pain in coded ways. Black women, wives, mothers, sisters acted as healers and confidants. Even if men never spoke of sexual abuse, they could collapse in a loved one's arms after a beating, receiving care that reaffirmed their humanity. Some resisted more directly. There were cases of slaves striking or killing abusive owners, though retaliation was swift and brutal. Such acts, though rare, reveal the depth of anguish and courage born from desperation. Most could not take that risk, but many surely fantasized about defiance or engaged in smaller acts like breaking tools or protecting one another from detection. Emancipation brought some relief, yet silence remained. Even free, black men were in danger if they admitted to relations with white women. The post-slavery South saw the deadly myth of the black male rapist fuel lynchings. In that climate, men who had been victimized dared not speak openly. Many carried secrets to their graves. Only in later generations, through WPA interviews or family stories, did hints surface of what had been endured. Another wound was the erasure of their victimhood. Society did not recognize enslaved black men as victims of sexual violence. That denial compounded trauma. To suffer and then be told it never happened, or that it didn't matter, deepened the pain. Historian Thomas Foster calls this a hidden history, noting that the absence of testimony reflects cultural refusal to see men as victims. Their silence was enforced not only by fear, but by a world unwilling to acknowledge their suffering. For black audiences today, hearing this may be painful, but it also validates. It reminds us that enslaved men were not unfeeling laborers, but human beings who felt humiliation, fear, and sorrow, and who carried burdens in silence. Their strength lies not just in labor or resistance, but in surviving while enduring violations no one should face. Recognizing this broadens our understanding of their resilience. The trauma did not vanish in 1865. It echoed into Reconstruction and beyond. How many men struggled with intimacy or trust shaped by what they endured? How many passed down a cautious wariness of white women, rooted in lived experience? These questions remain unanswerable, but the shadow of slavery stretched long. Yet despite silence, black men persevered. Some hinted at the truth in WPA interviews, speaking carefully of goings-on between mistresses and slaves. Others left nothing recorded, but their survival spoke volumes. Their descendants, living proof of endurance, carry forward the story. As we acknowledge their wounds, we also honor their spirit. They endured whippings, forced labor, sexual abuse, and humiliation, yet held on to their humanity. Each unnamed ancestor who survived gave us the chance to be here today. Their voices were silenced then, but by recognizing their full experience now, we give them long-denied acknowledgement. We remind ourselves that nothing, not even slavery's cruelties, could extinguish their spirit. For more than a century, the abuse of enslaved black men by white women remained hidden from mainstream history. This silence was not accidental. It was built on denial, cultural myths, and the deliberate erasure of uncomfortable truths. To end this story without confronting that silence would leave the narrative unfinished. The question is not just what happened, but why it remained unspoken for so long, and what breaking that silence means for us now. After the Civil War, the white South invested heavily in reshaping slavery's legacy. A romanticized image of the Old South took hold, filled with loyal slaves and kind masters. White women were placed at the center of these myths as gentle ladies who nursed the sick or taught Christian values. It was propaganda that disguised the reality of cruelty. Many white women themselves wrote novels or memoirs that reinforced this picture. Popular culture, from plantation fiction to later works like Gone with the Wind, helped fix these myths in place. These stories erased the truth of women like Miss Annie with her barrel whippings, the mistress who crushed a child's face under a rocking chair, or the daughter who forced a pregnancy on her father's slave. Such realities were too disruptive to the white imagination, so they were buried. We're active participants. Accepting this truth complicates history, but it also restores accuracy. Another reason for the silence came from the political terror of Reconstruction and Jim Crow. After emancipation, white society constructed the myth of the black male rapist, claiming black men were a threat to white women. This lie justified thousands of lynchings and brutal enforcement of segregation. In such an environment, no one dared to speak of black men as victims of white women's sexual aggression. The very idea contradicted the dominant narrative. A rumor that a white woman was involved with a black man could provoke mob violence. Silence was survival. White society refused to hear it, and black families often could not risk telling it. The sources that shaped written history reinforced this pattern. The majority of records came from white planters, newspapers, or memoirs that avoided implicating white women. Scandals like those Harriet Jacobs described might circulate as whispers, but rarely made it into writing. As a result, uncovering these truths required later generations to read between the lines, to re-examine the WPA slave interviews, and to take seriously the memories that had long been dismissed. In the last decade, works like Thomas Foster's The Sexual Abuse of Black Men Under American Slavery and Rethinking Rufus have brought this hidden history to the surface. For black communities today, acknowledging this truth is both painful and empowering. It shows that enslaved men were not only laborers or rebels, but also victims of sexual violence whose suffering was denied. Recognizing this does not lessen the horrors black women endured. Instead, it widens our understanding, showing how the entire black family was targeted through gendered abuse. Black women were raped by masters. Black men were coerced by mistresses. Both were forced into breeding by owners who sought profit above humanity. The entire system was built on domination of the body. Telling these stories now is an act of justice for the men who carried their pain in silence. Imagine an enslaved man who lived his whole life without telling anyone that the mistress came to his bed at night. He bore that shame, knowing disclosure could cost his life. When we speak of it now, we give his story recognition. We say, "It happened, it was wrong, and it will not be erased." Truth-telling cannot undo the harm, but it restores dignity to the memory of those who suffered. For modern audiences, this history also disrupts myths of white womanhood. White women were not only victims of patriarchy. Many were also wielders of racial power. They lived as oppressed in some ways, yet they were also oppressors who used slavery to gain authority. Understanding this complexity challenges simple morality tales and shows how racism corrupted anyone who held power. For black audiences, hearing this truth brings complex emotions: anger at the perpetrators, sorrow for the ancestors who endured it, validation for families who whispered about great-grandfathers forced into silence. It also reframes long-standing warnings about white women. Families often cautioned sons about false accusations, tragedies like Emmett Till being the stark reminder. Now we see that this danger has deeper roots, stretching back to slavery itself. Even then, a white woman's word or desire could decide whether a black man lived or died. Breaking the silence also honors the few who dared to tell. Harriet Jacobs included the story of a white daughter exploiting an enslaved man in her 1861 memoir, despite the scandal it caused. She knew the full truth had to be told. Her courage blazed a trail. Today, black historians, artists, and storytellers continue her work. We confront the painful history because it belongs to us, and because our ancestors deserve honesty. What do we do with this knowledge? We teach it. Any full account of slavery must include that white mistresses were often abusers. It must recognize that sexual violence went in many directions, not only from master to enslaved woman, but also from mistress to enslaved man. Only then do we see the full weight of how slavery violated black humanity. This truth also reframes how we view the struggles after emancipation. Freedmen who built schools, churches, and families were not only seeking political rights. They were healing from deep wounds. Legal marriages, community control, and education were ways to reclaim personhood stolen in slavery. These acts were antidotes to generations of violation. In telling this story now, we honor their resilience. Enslaved men survived unthinkable abuse and still passed life and culture to us. Each day they endured was a victory of spirit. Those daily victories built the foundation for freedom and for generations that followed. By telling their story honestly, we give them the recognition denied in life. The untold abuse of black men by white women can no longer stay hidden. Speaking it aloud is both reckoning and liberation. It reminds us that truth, however painful, is necessary for healing. It ensures that every victim of slavery's cruelty is remembered, not erased. And it affirms that our people endured, resisted, and survived. Telling the whole truth honors them, strengthens us, and keeps their voices alive. If this history moved you, make sure you hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and share this video so more people know the truth. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Culture Unlocked for more stories that history tried to silence.